Hi, everyone, and welcome to Specially Designed Instruction Part 2. I'm Ann Benninghoff, and most of you met me in Part 1, so won't need to do any further introduction of myself, but I'd like to share with you our learning targets for this session. There are two. I want to spend just a few moments with you reviewing the components of effective SDI, or specialized academic instruction if you're in California. And then we're going to look at the planning steps in detail for how do we figure out ways to integrate SDI into general ed curriculum and inclusive classrooms, etc. If you would like the handout, if you scan this QR code with the camera on your phone, you'll be able to download it, but I will also be showing it to you on the screen, so no worries if you can't download it at this point. I'll give you just a moment to pause in case you would like to do that, and then we'll start back together in just a few moments. All right, now to kick us off, we're going to do a brain dump and find out what you remember about SDI. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds on your piece of paper, and I want you to jot down as many things as you can possibly remember about SDI, what we talked about last time, or other thoughts, other knowledge that you have about specially designed instruction. Ready, set, go. All right. Those quick brain dumps are a wonderful way to stimulate prior knowledge with students. Usually when I do it with students, we'll have them take 30 seconds or a minute and try to recall information from the day before, and then they'll compare it with a peer to see how theirs might be similar or different. And then we can also show perhaps the lecture slides from the day before, and so that they can compare it to those notes as well. This is great for a virtual session. You could have students chat it into the chat box, or you can do it live with students. Now, let's compare then to some of what we talked about last time and see if you remember any of these details. I'm going to review the 3 whats and the 3 whys of SDI. So here we go. The 3 whats: adapting content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. Those are the 3 major categories where we adapt, we transform, we change up the lesson so that our students will be more successful. And then, in addition to these 3 things, we've got the 3 whys. What does the federal law tell us is the purpose behind doing this? First, it's to address those unique needs of a child with a disability, IEP goals, and other needs that a student might have. Second, it's to provide access to the general ed curriculum. This is why pull-out programs don't make as much sense, because it's harder in a pull-out situation to provide equitable access for students to the general ed curriculum. Not impossible, but much more difficult. And then third, it's to meet the standards. The federal law expects that the vast majority of our students with disabilities will meet the standards that are the same for children without disabilities. This is so important because we need to remember ourselves that the vast majority of students with disabilities don't have cognitive disabilities or intellectual disabilities. They are fully capable, if we're providing specially designed instruction, of overcoming the disability, the gap between where they are in the standards, and then meeting that standard. So our clues that we talked about last time for specially designed instruction, these might be some of the words in your brain dump. First, it's special. It's different than what the general ed teacher would be doing. Second, it's instruction. It's related to an IEP goal. And then that's going to mean there's data collection, progress monitoring, and we're building those lifelong independent learning skills. So I often think of it as generalizable. So let's look at a couple of examples and see what you remember. Last time we looked at this example, highlighter tape, and talked about what a great product this is to have kids physically interacting with text work using this tape, which is a re-stickable, removable adhesive. So first gut reaction from you, is this an example of SDI or a non-example? Hopefully your first gut reaction is non-example, because this is a tool, it's not instruction. And so it might be an accommodation for students. It's definitely a good practice and effective resource for kids to know about, but it's not SDI. Now here's one we haven't looked at before. This is a strategy I call prior knowledge spinner. My co-teacher and I, we were getting ready for students to be taking the statewide writing assessment. And throughout the year, whenever there was a prompt that they were given, we were using KWL charts to help activate their prior knowledge. But it dawned on me as we were starting to move towards testing season that we wouldn't be able to prompt students' prior knowledge when they came across a writing prompt that made them uncomfortable. And so some of our kids, they just have figured out how to activate their own prior knowledge, but a lot of students with disabilities might need more explicit instruction in how do you do that? And so I started to think about, well, how do I activate my prior knowledge? One of the things that I might do, kind of my metacognitive process, would be to go through the different question words and ask myself those questions to get me thinking. So let's say, as an example, right now you asked me to write a paragraph on coding, computer coding. Well, I don't think I know anything about that. So my instinct might be to panic a little bit, but then I would kick into this metacognitive process and I might think to myself, well, who do I know that knows something about coding? And then all of a sudden, Debbie would come to mind and I would think, oh yeah, I've seen some posts of hers on Facebook. And I remember her telling me about this app that she used to teach coding. Or maybe I might say, well, where might I have learned about coding? And I think about all the places maybe I've been in the last year. Oh, I went to that science museum and they had an exhibit. So by using the question words, that can prompt our thinking to give us something to get started with, rather than just giving up and having nowhere to go. So we decided to teach this to students. To make it a little more hands-on, I created these spinners, and we would have students put a paper clip in the center with their pencil tip holding it down, spin it, see where it landed, and then go through that process to try to activate their own prior knowledge. Now, of course, they're not going to have the spinner when they take the test, but they've got the question words. If we keep practicing it and keep practicing it and practice it eventually without the spinner, then they have the question words to help them with that. So I did definitely have some students in this class who had IEP goals that were related to retention, recalling, memory. We also had some around writing on topics that they were given as prompts. Lots of different IEP goals that I could say this was related to. So what's your instinct right now? Is this an example or a non-example of SDI? For me, I would consider this an example. It was something very different than what the general ed teacher was doing, so it was special, at least initially. It was very designed and intentional, and it was instruction in addition to just the tool. We had IEP goals that were related. We kept some data on how students were able to do that through their writing process, and it was something they could transfer or generalize by just learning how to use those 6 question words. All right, let's look at one more. WikiSticks. Many of you are familiar with WikiSticks. They're one of my favorite hands-on manipulatives. They're pieces of string that are covered in wax, so they're bendable and shapeable like pipe cleaners would be, but instead of having that metal center that kids turn into a dagger to poke each other with, they're a lot safer. You can do flat things on tabletops or paper, but you can also build 3-dimensional images and objects with them. So I really like using these particularly when we're trying to review or summarize a concept. And I do have students that have IEP goals around summarizing, paraphrasing, restating, that type of thing. And so I might say to students at the end of a lesson, I want you to summarize your learning with the wiki sticks. Build me a symbolic representation and then be able to share it with the class and explain your summarization. I've used this to have students summarize communism, summarize a unit on memoir. It can be used at all different levels, just with different expectations of the output for students. Is this an example of SDI? And if you're unsure, I would say that's probably about right. I don't think that WikiSticks are an example of SDI. They are a wonderful tool, very interactive way of going about helping students to learn something, but they are not an example of SDI. And yet we may have kids use them in a way that could start to feel special, right? We don't usually have kids build a symbolic representation of a memoir. And so that in and of itself, depending upon how we're doing that, and if we can help kids figure out how to transition that to other settings where they're not necessarily going to have the wiki sticks to carry around, then in all of those ways, maybe it might start to be special. But the items themselves, they're tools. They're wonderful tools, but just tools. All right, well now let's go into our 7 planning steps for SDI. And these are on the QR code Google Doc that you were able to access earlier, or you can go back and download it, but I'll go through these steps with you. What I did is put together kind of steps that represent my thinking on how do I build in SDI, particularly when I'm collaborating with someone else, with the general ed teacher, and working on the general ed curriculum. So these first 3 steps to me are information gathering steps. And we'll look at these 3, go through each of them, and then I'll show you some video of this happening. So before we jump in, a little puzzle for you. One of the things we know about puzzling is that the process of puzzling releases dopamine. And maybe you can remember from last time, what does dopamine do for us? Does lots of great things. Dopamine makes us feel happy, it improves memory, and it increases sustained attention or perseverance. So it keeps kids with us longer. So whenever I can drop a puzzle into the middle of instruction, I'm going to do that. I'll show you now one that I like to do with students, and it's based on this very popular app called 4 Picks 1 Word. So some of you may be familiar with it. The idea is on your phone, you get this app, and then you see 4 different pictures, and you have to find out what is the one word that connects them all and brings them together. So I thought, well, if that worked to grab kids' attention in an app, I could do that with keywords in instruction. So I'll do 2 quick examples with you. I'm going to pop up 4 pictures, and your job is to guess what is the one word that brings them all together. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you guessed reflection, you're right. So let's say I was doing a lesson with students on how to be reflective readers or reflective writers or reflective mathematicians or whatever it might be, then I might use this to get them thinking about that word. Here's another one for us, for our content today. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you said something about goal or target, then you are right. That's what we're looking at as our first step, is identifying the learning target. And we have to make sure we're really clear about that so that the students can be clear about what they need to do. And also so that I, as a specialist, make sure that the specially designed instruction is geared to the right thing. So we want to have lots of clarity about that learning target. Then the second question, or the second step, is to identify those challenging points. What about this will be hard for students? Sometimes the general ed teacher has a better sense of that than I do because they have taught it before, maybe I might not have. But I also know students with disabilities and what might be a struggle there. So we like to identify that. And then third, what specific IEP goals will we address? It is the job of a special educator to be addressing those goals on a daily basis. So we need to identify what it is that we're going to work on. This means that we have to have some method for keeping them in mind while we are lesson planning. So if you have a method that you're using that's working really efficiently to keep those IEP goals in mind every day for lesson planning, then wave your arms, pat yourself on the back, give yourself a little cheer, whatever you'd like. That's great. I'm going to show you what I do. And I think that we need a really efficient method because it's way too cumbersome to pull open a student's document file online, dig through, find the IEP pages with all the goals, and then set that aside, find another student, That's way too cumbersome. And so it doesn't happen often enough. So here's what I've done is I've just created a simple little chart for each class that I am co-teaching or teaching. If I'm in a classroom all day long, which I'm not, but every once in a while, sometimes special ed teachers are with the same group of students or the same kind of co-taught all day long, then we might break this out by period or by content area. So this would be for literacy content. And down the left-hand column, we put the first names of the students that are in the class that have IEP goals that are related to this. So if I have a student with math IEP goals, that is something we're not going to be addressing in a literacy block, then they wouldn't even show up on this. In addition to the academic goals, though, there might be social behavioral goals. And so you can see that this student has a couple of goals related to that, not content related, but we feel like we could address them in this literacy lesson, then I'm going to have them in front of me as well. Now, you may also notice that we don't have the entire lengthy language of the goals in front of us. That's not necessary. It'd probably get in the way. Our emphasis is trying to get everything on one page. So we may have to go to really small print to make it happen. But as soon as you go to 2 pages or 3 pages, the likelihood of you actually using it and keeping it fresh and out when you're planning so that you're finding it user-friendly, that's unlikely. So that's our solution. Those first 3 steps now, you can see they are information-oriented, information gathering. So now I'm going to show you a video clip of a planning meeting that I had with Jeff. Jeff had not taught with me before, but in the prior year, he'd had some lessons as a solo teacher that he felt didn't go particularly well. He's teaching now US government, and as you're watching this video, even though you might be teaching first grade or 5th grade math or maybe high school science, whatever it might be, the process of the 7 steps is the same, and that's what I want to demonstrate for you. So in this clip, particularly notice how we talk about the learning target. The original learning target he had sounded pretty straightforward and clear, but then as we progressed, we realized that we could change it up a little bit to make it even stronger and more succinct, more focused for student understanding. So we're going to see about 2 minutes of this planning, and then 2 to 3 minutes, and I'll stop it and we'll look at the next few steps and then watch some more of the video. Here we go. And if you'd like to stand while you're watching, feel free to do that. I might do that. It's always good to get some blood out of the lower part of your body and back to your brain. All right, so Jeff, I know that this is the lesson that you were feeling like didn't work so well last year,
Yeah.
and so we're going to try and figure out how to transform it a little bit.
Sure.
Your learning target is pretty straightforward, really clear. I love that. I can list, define, and provide examples of each of the 7 roles of the President of the United States. Is that changing? Do you feel like that still is what you want them to do?
I'm not convinced that it's important that they can list the roles of the president. I think I think if they can identify the roles, they can be familiar with them. But I don't know if that list term is really needed for us.
Well, true, because we're not teaching them how to make a list,
No,
right? And
right,
that probably makes it more accessible for some of the kids.
right.
So define and provide examples. Isn't that in essence describing?
Sure.
So could we just say, would it be right to say, I can describe each of the 7 roles of the president?
Yeah, I think that would really clarify that.
Okay.
I think it would clarify it.
Good. All right, great. So I can describe. So by the end of a lesson, or the end of, is this 2 or 3 days of material, or what
Yeah,
are you thinking?
I think in the past it's taken about 2.5 days to do. And so
Okay.
yeah, 2 or 3 day allotment of time for the type would be sufficient.
Great, because it did sound like a lot
Yeah,
for some of our students,
right.
especially some of our students with IEPs. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is a lot in one lesson.
Yeah,
Okay.
seven roles of the president is a challenge for some. Yes.
Okay. So what was difficult about it when you've taught it before?
A couple things that I think we've struggled with. Number one, just the amount, like 7 roles of the president, and that's a lot for students, for all students, really to remember, and not only remember, but give some examples of it. That's the first thing I think they really struggled with. The second thing is some of the terminology that we use for the roles of the president are foreign to the students. For example, there's one of the roles that we call chief of state, which is the ceremonial function for the president. And that word state kind of trips students up, because when they hear the word state, they think Wisconsin, they think Minnesota.
Sure.
They don't think President Trump laying a wreath at Arlington National Cemetery. It's that role.
Right. So I hear you say 2 kind of primary things. One is memory
Mhm.
issues, like remembering. They have to remember all 7,
Yeah,
and what those mean. And then the other is the term, some of the vocabulary that's within it.
right.
And that actually works in really well with the IEP goals for the students in our class that
Mhm.
have IEP goals, because we have several that have memory goals,
Yeah,
and then the vocabulary is all about comprehension, and there's a lot of goals.
right. I
related
think
to that.
almost all of our students have some sort of goal related to that vocabulary.
Okay. Okay. Good. So I think we've got IEP goals in there. So, I was thinking about. All right. So you can see how quickly we can deal with the these first 3 steps. We want to be really efficient in our work through our lesson planning process, because we don't have time otherwise to plan all the lessons we need for the week. I like to try and get through planning one lesson in about 10 minutes. So boom, 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 right? Pretty quick. So those first 3 steps, to help you remember them, I'm going to suggest now that you doodle something around these first 3. Step 1, which is clarify the learning target. Step 2, which is to identify what will be challenging, what's hard about this. And step 3, which is what are the IEP goals that we're going to work on. So take 1 minute, do some doodling. Don't worry about whether it's great drawing or not, just something that will help you remember those 3 steps. Here's my timer, and let's take 1 minute. All right, there we go. Now, I can't see your doodles, but if you feel like taking a picture of them with your phone and sending them to my email, I'd love that. I'll give you my email at the end of the session, and I always like to see what people have created. Now, we are about to move on to steps 4, 5, and 6. But before we do, because we're going to be talking a little bit in this next video clip about memory, I'd love for you to jot down on your paper the names of 2 or 3 students that you know that struggle with memory issues. They may have IEP goals around memory, or you see in class they have a hard time remembering things. Just jot down their names on first names on your piece of paper so that you can keep them in mind as we go along. Okay, now let's look at step 4 and talk about that a bit. Identify the metacognitive process that a successful learner might use. If you've got the paper or if you're jotting these down, put a great big star, 2 or 3 or 4 stars next to step 4. For me, this step has been the game changer out of all of my work in SDI. Once I realized that if I spent some time thinking about, how do I approach that task? And if I could take that metacognition and turn it into something concrete, then I could explain to students how they could do it. And often my metacognitive process is different than the way that the curriculum is teaching it. If my way is the exact same way that the gen ed curriculum teaches it, then I might go and ask other people. I might ask my husband, I might ask my coworker, what's their process? Because in hearing about their process, that gives us an alternative to the one approach that might not be working for our students. So that's step 1. Then we start to adapt and transform that approach. Like, how can we do this differently? And this is where we're bringing in usually a lot of movement for students, hands-on, maybe some visuals, perhaps some chunking or more directed instruction, thinking about those executive function skills that might be necessary. These are the things that really transform a lesson. So making sure that we're thinking about attention and perhaps also thinking about organization or impulsivity, all of those executive function or work skills, not just the academic skills. Both are going to be really important to transform that lesson. So we're going to watch again as Jeff and I talk, but in this particular video clip, about 4 minutes in length, I want you to notice how, as the special educator, I'm using my expertise in those executive function or access skill areas. I don't need to be the expert in the content area. Jeff is the expert in that. We have a general ed math expert or a general ed history expert or general ed first grade expert. So we don't really need 2 of those teachers together. What we need is the specialist to be bringing something different. They have a different expertise. As a specialist, I have expertise in instructional strategies and how to overcome disabilities through developing certain other alternative access skills and so forth. So we want to make sure that in our planning, the special ed teacher is bringing in their unique perspective or expertise. All right, that's what you're watching for. Watch now as we talk about steps 4, 5, and 6. I was thinking about this. I had taken a quick glance at this morning, and I was thinking about what I know about the memory research. And so I want to come at it first from that angle. Are you anticipating that you're going to lecture about each of the roles?
Yeah, so what I've done in the past is kind of a couple different parts. So I'd lecture for 3, 4, 5 minutes about one of the roles. Then there'd be a discussion question where the students would have a partner and they discuss a scenario related to the role, and then we do some large group conversation. Those small partner discussions honestly haven't gone so well in the past, and I just don't feel like students get a good grasp on the role, so then they're not able to have a good conversation about it, and so it kind of has fallen apart.
Right. So when you're lecturing, students are taking notes?
Yes, they have a note sheet, a guided note sheet in front of them where they're writing down the definitions, and then they're also recording some examples of the present role.
So I know some of our kids, when they're struggling with note taking, part of the issue is they're trying to multitask, right? There's a lot of cognitive load there. So you're lecturing and you're probably giving some extra really great information, not just the line that's on the slide, but they're so busy trying to write down that exact line that they're not really listening to you. And I hate that they're missing all of that. So I've recently been doing a lot of reading around memory, and one of the things that the research says is this concept of retrieve taking instead of note taking. So retrieve taking is you say to the student, I'm going to tell you for 5 minutes, or I'm going to lecture for a few minutes about this, and you are not allowed to take notes. So it's pens down, and they just have to listen to you. And then when you're done, you say, now write down everything you can remember about what I just said.
Hmm.
So you forewarn them that that's what they're going to do.
Sure.
So what they're doing there is they're retrieving the information that
Yeah.
they've just heard. They're trying to retrieve that and write it down. And then you can have students compare
Right.
their notes to a peer's notes or to your
Sure.
lecture slide or something and see if they missed anything.
Great. And if they did miss something, can they add to them?
Yes. Yes, they add that in.
Sure.
So what the research shows is that that's actually more likely to consolidate the memory than if they're doing that heavy cognitive load and multitasking and
Right.
not paying attention.
Yeah, I really like that because I'm not concerned I'm not concerned that they can reiterate exactly, what I said, but have an understanding in their own words. And I think this is really allowing them to do that.
That also kind of takes care of any kids who have visual perception problems where, they're looking up at the board and far point copying is hard or, all of that, which just becomes difficult for them.
Sure.
The other thing is that there's a lot of memory research that says, as an example, that when you use a graphic organizer of some kind to gather your information rather than linear notes, that having information in locations on a page is easier to recall.
Oh,
so that's called
interesting.
episodic memory. So when you just have a long list of kind of linear sketch notes, much harder to close your eyes and picture where things were.
Yeah.
Whereas if instead you've got information in locations on a page, you can kind of close your eyes and think, okay, it was in that top right hand corner, and it's
Sure.
easier to remember.
Okay.
So given that I knew that this is where you're going, I was thinking about, there's a memory strategy. I forget what it's called. It's like the mansion memory trick or something.
Okay.
But the idea is that the memory champions, there's a memory championship, an international memory
Interesting.
championship. And what they do is they picture a house with lots of rooms, and then they put information in each room and they travel through the house, and then they can remember, okay, I turned right here and there was this, and so it's like this. So I was thinking if we could do a hybrid of that. What if we just had kids either draw, or we could give them like a 2-story house with 3 or 4 rooms on the bottom and a couple of rooms up top.
Sure.
And as they went through the 7 roles, they were actually kind of putting the roles in
each of the
spaces. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't have some linear notes, maybe, but maybe all of their notes could be in rooms instead.
I love that. And because we're talking about the roles of the president, maybe we could even make it the White House as the house that was there. That might be kind of fun.
Really great.
Okay, so you could hear a couple of strategies there that I shared with him related to memory. One is the Palace memory strategy. That's what it's called. I couldn't think of it at the time, but it's called the Palace memory strategy. And you maybe have heard of that before. It's actually a fairly ancient idea, but with good solid research behind it. By the way, if you're interested in the book about the memory championships, it's called Moonwalking with Einstein, which is kind of an unusual title, but Moonwalking with Einstein. And it's a fascinating memoir about the author who decides to try to study to become a memory champion. And he learns all of these techniques, including that one. But the other strategy there that I mentioned was the strategy of retrieve taking instead of note taking. And every teacher that I have convinced to give that a try has raved about how effective it is. So right now I'm thinking back to earlier when I asked you to jot down a couple of students' names. I'm betting that there are some students that when you're lecturing and asking them to write stuff simultaneously, that they're having a hard time following. And so if you are doing some of that, you might want to think about that retrieve taking strategy. Don't write anything down until after I've talked for 4 or 5 minutes, then write down what I've said. And then they can compare with students. Now, before we move on, let's talk about, was this yet an example of SDI, or what within it might have been or might not have been? So the idea of giving students a piece of paper with a White House on it, that's a graphic organizer. Graphic organizers are not SDI. Why? Well, they're general ed. They're very common in general ed settings to have a graphic organizer. So there's nothing all that special about it. And it's not really instruction. However, If instead here we teach students this memory strategy, we explain to them what the research says about episodic memory and location-driven memory versus semantic memory, and how you can create graphic organizers of all different types. And if we teach them that strategy, now it becomes instruction, and they can begin to create their own graphic organizers. And now it's something that's transferable and generalizable. And that's probably going well beyond what a general ed teacher would typically be doing with graphic organizers. So that's where the specially designed instruction becomes a part of this. Okay, now to help you remember these three, let's go ahead and doodle again for step 4, 5, and 6. So step 4 is what is the metacognitive process? Step 5 is how are we going to adapt or transform the old way? And step 6 is what are those executive function skills or access skills that we might need to address, as well as the academic content. So take 1 minute, doodle something to help you remember those 4 steps. Okay, come on back with me now, and let's look at our last step, which is to build in specific methods to boost participation. We can have all of the best planning in place, but if students aren't participating, they're not going to get anything out of it. So we have to make sure we've thought about what do we know from the research about participation and the best ways to engage students. So here's my question for you. What is the best way to boost participation? Jot down what do you think is the best way, or maybe the top 2 or 3 ways to boost participation. Now, I'm sure there are lots of different answers. I'm going to tell you that my answer to this question, number 1 best way, is small groups. When we can move into small group instruction, we are automatically going to boost participation. Imagine that you're 2 adults in a room and you're choosing to teach whole class. Maybe you have time for 3 or 4 students to share their writing out loud, or to make a connection between the content and their own experiences. But as soon as you move into 2 groups, you've doubled participation, just like that. And so it's so much easier to boost participation when we're in smaller groups. We can also pull them in closer when we're in small groups. We can make eye contact with every single one of them. We can see their papers or their work better, so we know that they're getting it, so it's better for formative assessment. Students that might be shy or introverted or have some anxiety in front of a large group are a little more comfortable in that small group. So many ways that we boost participation. So when we're doing co-teaching, I have kind of a target percentage that I look for small group time. And if you've been through co-teaching training with me, you may know this, but take a guess. Think about, out of the course of a week, if we've got 2 adults in the classroom, what percentage of the time throughout the week would I say should be spent in small teacher-led instructional groups? So I'm not talking about cooperative learning groups, but actually instructional groups. What percentage of time do I recommend?
Well, if your answer came anywhere near 65%, then you're ready to give yourself a pat on the back. 65% is what I reach for. 70%, 75% is what my colleague Sonia Kunkel suggests. Somewhere in that range, because there are so many advantages. It boosts participation, but also it gives us the opportunity to do specially designed instruction. Not every IEP goal will work well for all students in the class. So while we've looked at a lot of examples of SDI whole group, we also know that we're going to have times when we're going to need to be much more intensive with small groups of students with IEP goals. And so small group instruction is just the way to go. Now, there are some other ways to boost participation, though. One of the ways that might have come to mind for you is movement. Movement is so powerful. Here's a piece of research I love, and you can read this out loud with me if you'd like. Here we go. The more the learners use learning activities with movement, the higher their academic achievements. Raise your hand if you want higher academic achievements. I think I might raise both hands for that. Of course, this is what we all want. And the research shows that when we can bring movement into it, we do get those higher academic achievements. So it could be simple movement, like having students create a gesture, or perhaps you give them a gesture that they have to model, that you model and they have to repeat or mimic after you. As an example, when I'm teaching opinion writing, we have students make an O with their hand. They put it against their chests to indicate opinions start with us, and then we're sharing them out. So opinion writing gesture goes like this, and you can do that with me. And when students are doing physical gestures, sometimes we refer to that as total physical response, or TPR. And that language comes out of the ELD, English Language Development field. Those gestures are so powerful for all students, but particularly for kids whose language skills may not be as good. So gestures might be a great way, or getting kids up and moving around the room for other reasons. Well, let's see what Jeff and I come up with here for how to boost participation as we talk in this last segment about the last step in our process.
7 roles.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've got multiple roles, is there a way we could do it in multiple stations
Sure.
instead of whole group?
Yeah, that might be more effective.
You don't need to get them all done in one day, so we could do 3 one day, 4 the next.
I like that. Yeah.
Now, if there's more than 2 and there's only 2 of us, that would mean we're going to have at least one station that has to be independent.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you think we could create a station that had some, I don't know, using technology?
Yeah.
They were provided the information?
Sure. I think we could easily make a station just with some quick current event video clips of President Trump or another past president using or performing those roles, or you or I could make a really quick 5-minute video that summarizes the role with some examples. So I think we certainly can, maybe a QR code that the kids scan with the iPad and
Right.
there and watch that.
Great. So some kind of flipped instruction in a sense, but right there in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And then we could have you at one role and I could be at another role. Now, what do you think about, I'm thinking about the students with IEP goals and really wanting to really double down on that memory instruction.
Mm-hmm.
So while we could give all the students, like I could give an overview to all the kids about that mansion idea, we're going to use the White House, we're going to put these in there, but I'd love to be able to really hit that harder with students that need that.
Absolutely.
So what if we did at least one leveled group?
Okay.
So we have 3 groups. We have one that was leveled with memory IEP goals.
Yep.
And I could actually move with that group rather
good.
than me staying put.
Sure.
So whatever, that would mean that you'd have to move too, right?
Yep.
So if you have one station, I have another station, we'd both need to be able to know how to teach at each station.
Yeah, that's fine.
But then I could kind of double down on that.
I love it.
Okay, I like that better.
So here you can see that we're going to have students moving from group to group. So we're going into small groups. And because we'll have at least one leveled group, I'll be able to provide some of that extra intensity that we're going to need for students that have IEP goals related to memory and so forth.
But in addition to that, then Jeff and I got started talking about some gestures, and we decided that we could create a gesture for each role of the presidency and have the students do the gestures, so commander in chief, pretty obvious, but we could create something for each of those roles. So we're adding in a little bit of extra tactile kinesthetic opportunity for students to help them with memory. So in approximately 10 minutes, we plan out the outline of a lesson. Now, the way we can be so efficient here is that we have a shared Google Doc for our lesson planning, and Jeff will start by inputting the learning targets for the next 5 days. So at any point when I'm free, I can go onto that shared document, look at what those learning targets are, and if I'm unclear about them, I can email him a question, or I can be ready when we sit down to ask questions to clarify that target. We also are efficient because the special ed teachers have committed to previewing the content. So it's not our very first time when we sit down together saying, hey, what are we teaching next week? Let me see the text or your packets. Right? So Jeff might put some of those content references into the document so that I can familiarize myself with it before I show up. I don't have to be intimately familiar, ready to teach it, but I have to know it enough to be able to start to talk about where the difficulties are going to lie and how we might transform the lesson. Another way that we sometimes help with some of the efficiency is that we kind of divide and conquer some of those roles. Like, I'm just going to take responsibility for vocabulary, and he trusts that I have a whole bunch of vocabulary strategies that I can pull in. Or maybe we decide that I'll come up with an activator and the closure for the lesson, and then he creates the other pieces. And so when we have that trust back and forth, we can quickly take some of those tasks and do them at other times. So I might be driving to work and I'm thinking, hey, how am I going to activate that lesson tomorrow? Or what can I do for vocabulary? I can be thinking about that maybe while I'm cooking dinner or something like that. And then we put it all together. All right, so we've been through our 7 steps. Now I want to do a little retrieval practice with you. So please flip your papers over or somewhere your notes so that you cannot see the 7 steps. And then maybe on the back of your notes or on a fresh piece of paper or on a Post-it, whatever you've got, list the numbers 1 through 7. And then let's see how many of the steps you can remember. Don't worry if you get a few out of order. The order has some value to it, but if they're mixed up a little bit in order, no big deal. So go ahead and see how many of the 7 you can come up with. I'll put 1 minute on the clock. Here we go. All right, I'll go over the 7 and I'll see if I remember them in order and you see if you got them in order too. So step 1, clarify the learning target. Step 2, talk about what's difficult. What are students going to struggle with? Step 3, IEP goals. Let's make sure we really know what those goals are that we're working on. Step 4, what is the metacognitive process that a successful learner would use? Step 5 is to begin to adapt and transform that lesson. This is usually where I'm adding lots of tactile, kinesthetic, visuals, alternate methods. Step let's see, we're up to 6. Step 6 is what are the executive function skills or access skills that students would need, and how are we going to address those? And then step 7, last but not least, how do we boost participation or ensure that we've got good participation from students? So if you did well with getting maybe like 5 out of 7 of those, great, give yourself a round of applause. Good job. Those steps really help me to be effective and efficient in my planning of SDI. Now let's look at another example of SDI. This is kind of a bonus strategy for you. And we'll talk about how it might be and it might not be, and what would be the difference between the two. So this is a strategy I call conversation cubes. I was co-teaching in a class that we were including students that had IEP goals around communication. I had one student whose goal was to talk in small group, to contribute to small group discussion. This student was fairly introverted and anxious about speaking out loud. She had had in early life a bit of a stutter, and so some of that anxiety was still with her, and she hesitated to participate. I also had a student who blurted out loud all the time, had problems with impulse control, verbal impulse control, and was always dominating conversations. And so they had an IEP goal about trying to control those impulses and monitor their participation. So with that in mind, what we decided to do is to try it whole class first. We put kids into groups of 4, and the reason that we work with 3 or 4 is that we know from cooperative learning research that as soon as you go to a group of 5, the 5th student is likely to opt out of participating. So if you want maximum participation, groups of 3 or 4 are best for that. Now it's different if I as a teacher am sitting with a group, then I could have 8 or 10 or 15. But if they're meant to be kind of working somewhat independently, then 3 or 4 is best. And we gave each student in the group a pile of these little colorful math manipulative cubes. Now we weren't using them for math, but I love anything that's tactile and manipulative. We know that it helps to keep student attention at a much higher rate. And so we gave one student a pile of blue, one a pile of red, one yellow, and one a pile of orange. Then we said to them, every time they contributed to the conversation that day in their small group, they were to stack a cube. We gave them an assignment to talk about, and then we stepped back to just let them get started. After maybe about 4 or 5 minutes, we said, okay, everybody freeze. And now let's do a little analysis of your conversation tower. Should it be red, yellow, blue, orange, red, yellow, blue, orange, red, yellow, blue, orange? Probably not. That's not very authentic conversation. But should it be red, 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 blue, yellow, red, 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 yellow, orange, blue, red, red, red? No, it shouldn't be that either. So we talked about what should it look like and how to monitor for that. Then we put them back to work with it, tried again, stopped, did some analysis, and so forth. We actually did this for several days running with the conversation cubes until we felt that the students were being more successful with that. Now, they can't carry conversation cubes around with them in their pockets, so is this generalizable yet? Yes, it's special because gen ed teacher probably wouldn't have gone to this length. It is instruction, IEP goals and data, but it's not very transferable yet. So what I realized is that it was worth taking the time for those students who really needed it to then teach them how to transition from the cubes to something else. So for a few days, we did some practice with colored pencils instead of cubes. And then after that, I showed them how they could just tally their participation rates on a piece of paper with a pen or a pencil by putting the initials or names of students on the piece of paper and then just putting a little check mark next to it every time they participated or someone else did too. And so in that way, we showed them how they could carry this forward to help monitor their own behavior in other settings.
Lots of us as adults do that kind of thing. I know that I do. When I'm in a meeting with other people, I often put their names around the edge of a piece of paper and kind of monitor or put notes alongside those names and kind of watch my own level of interaction. I also know there is a very successful app out there that does the same kind of thing, that you can track participation on a team so that you can make sure you're getting a good balance of input from everybody. So it's definitely a lifelong skill that we're teaching. So that's one more strategy that you could use with your students in the future. Now, as we start to wrap up here, what I'd like you to do is take a moment and write one sentence that summarizes what we've said about planning for specially designed instruction. How would you capture it all in one sentence? So take a moment and write that sentence down. Go. And finish up your thought, and then come on back with me. Now, before I have you jot down some next steps, let me just review a couple of common questions that I get about specially designed instruction, in case you're still, having these questions roll around in your head, or you're thinking that you might face them as you share your ideas with colleagues. So one of the most common questions I get is, can it be SDI if we're doing it for the whole class? Yes, it's SDI for the students who have IEP goals related to that specially designed instruction you're providing. The phrase SDI does not apply to general ed students. So for those students in the class, if we're doing it whole class, for them it's incidental benefit. They might benefit from it, but it's not SDI because it's just a legal term that doesn't apply to them. So SDI can be done whole class, but it's really only, that label is only applicable to students with IEP goals that are related. So if you have a student with a math IEP goal, but you're doing SDI around literacy, then that doesn't apply to them at that point because they don't need it. They don't have that IEP goal that says that they need it. Another question I get is, are we supposed to be doing specially designed instruction every day? And my answer to that is yes, probably in most circumstances. There may be a time here or there where you're assessing a student instead of teaching them, but for the most part, we've got SDI minutes that are written in such a way that we probably should be working on them almost every day. So on a daily basis, I ask myself, what am I doing today that was special? Or what will I be doing today that's special? I also encourage principals when they're doing walkthroughs to feel comfortable saying to a teacher, a special ed teacher, hey, what are you doing that's special today? Or what IEP goal are you working on in this lesson? And we should know the answer to that because that is the expectation under federal law, that that is what we're working on. And so, yes, we try to work on it every day. Do we do 45 minutes of SDI in a 45-minute lesson? No. When I'm co-teaching in general ed, I might be doing 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes of SDI, sometimes maybe 30 minutes, but never are we doing SDI from bell to bell. And so eventually we want to start thinking about really writing our minutes in the IEPs in ways that are probably more accurately reflective of what we're doing with students. They're getting lots of time from me, but that time is not always me implementing specially designed instruction. I might be offering an accommodation. I might be just supporting good instructional strategies or the general ed curriculum, the way that they're teaching. And so the specially designed instruction is not bell to bell in most cases. So those are a handful of common questions. If you have additional questions, feel free to email me. And on the very next slide, I'll give you my email address so you can reach out if you need to. But right now, I want you to jot down 2 next steps that you're going to take as a result of this session. So it could be that you want to have a conversation with someone about planning a little bit differently. Maybe you need to have a conversation with a school administrator about how to fit planning time into your day-to-day life. Perhaps you're going to just try planning using the 7 steps. You may also have found some strategies today that you want to use, that Palace memory strategy or the conversation cubes. Maybe you like that prior knowledge spinner. Well, that prior knowledge spinner is available for download on my website, and my website is ideasforeducators.com. If you go there, one of the tabs will say more, and if you click that, it brings you to a downloadable site where there are dozens of Blackline Masters, many of which are in my Super Strategies for Everyday Teaching book. So you can check that out if you want. Also, my new edition of Co-Teaching That Works will be out in a few months. It should be available June of 2020. It's available now for pre-purchase, but in it there is a chapter on specially designed instruction that goes through some other examples and takes you step by step through the process. So you can check that out if you think that would be a good resource for you. Thanks so much for your participation, and I hope to hear from you if you have any questions whatsoever. Best of luck at offering high quality, specially designed instruction to your students with disabilities. They really need us to be providing the special for them so that they can be successful in school. Thank you.